It's just a bunch of stupid trees. That's what they said. I couldn't believe it. Just a bunch of stupid trees. Can you believe they said that? You seem confused. Could it be that you need a few more details? Maybe the context? I heard somebody going, yes. All right, I'll give that to you. We had a youth group mission trip in Arizona, working alongside our sister church in the Navajo Nation. And while we were there, they took us to the Navajo National Monument, which has this beautiful switchback trail down to an aspen forest overlook. And so we took that trail. I was in the back of the group, and before I even got down to the overlook, a few of our girls were already coming back up the trail past me. And that's what they said. It's just a bunch of stupid trees. And then they went to the gift shop. Now you're starting to get it. A bunch of stupid trees? Okay, well, technically they were partially right. The overlook did, in fact, look over trees. But boy, they missed a lot. What did they leave out? What did they miss? Only all the breathtaking details. This is a white aspen forest, white trunks with a dark green canopy of leaves contrasted against the red rock walls of the canyon. It is gorgeous. But they didn't see that. They couldn't see this picturesque masterpiece of God's creative hand. All they saw was a bunch of stupid trees. Now, by the way, none of them, as far as I know, are here this morning, so I think I'm safe in telling this story, and it was quite a while back, so don't blame any of our current youth group students. Now, you notice here that when I said it to you at first, it didn't make a lot of sense until you had details, until you had context. So initially, you didn't have the context, and in the tale that I gave to you, they absolutely missed a lot of details and didn't get the context of what they were looking at. We were hiking, and a group of students said, "It's just a bunch of stupid trees." That sentence is true, but it misses numerous details that would lead to a far richer understanding of what happened. How about today's scripture text? What is the latter half of Mark 6 about? Jesus miraculously fed 25,000 people, and he walked on the water. Sermon over, church dismissed. Oh, but maybe there are a few other details that we're missing, and just maybe what Mark really wants to get through to us is not first and foremost, Jesus did 2 miracles. There's a lot more to it, such as, who was Jesus feeding? And why were they there? And where were they? Why did they need food? Why did Jesus choose to perform the miracle in the first place? What led him to walk on the water? Why did the winds need to be calmed? How did all the people in the narrative respond to these actions? And of course, also, what does all this have to do with us? The simple summary, Jesus miraculously fed 25,000 people in the wilderness and then walked on water, doesn't address any of the questions that we just asked. But unfortunately, many of us are completely content to know the simplistic summary of the Bible's accounts and rarely, if ever, dig deeper to find the riches that can be mined there. If you're not following this so far, let me try a different tact. Do I have any fans of the movie Frozen out in the audience there? All right, I see 2 hands. Okay, 2 people liked that movie. Well, let me ask you this. 3 hands. Frozen has been described this way. After the death of her parents, a young socialite causes millions in property damage. Is that statement technically true? Yes, that is a summary of the movie Frozen. But if you are a fan of the movie Frozen, you are far from content with that summary. For those of you who maybe are a little older or who don't like Disney musical cartoons, how about Star Wars? It's just summarized this way: deadbeat dad tries to get his son to take over the family business. True? Technically, yes, that is a true statement. But again, it misses the heart of the story. It's not even close. Now, if we're not content to have our favorite fictional stories summarized in such a simplistic way, why in the world are we so content to leave our understanding of the Bible at such a reductionistic level as we so often do? When we willfully ignore the details of a story, we are the poorer for it. Those girls missed the beauty right in front of them, and we miss the most important aspects in the Bible, including here in Mark chapter 6. One other metaphor before we dig into the text. Parents, how many times have you watched your child agonize over a math problem? Sometimes for a half an hour or even an hour, while all the time, can I help you with that? No. Well, just let me help. No. And they get madder and madder and more upset, and the tears are flowing, and maybe they're slamming their fist on the table and cursing mathematics for even existing. And then eventually they give in and they accept help. And you look over their shoulder, and in about 30 seconds you say, oh, you just forgot to carry the 1. And they go, head slap. Oh my gosh, there it is. And they solve the problem and everything settles down, and you think, why didn't you just let me help in the first place? It was that simple. You forgot one little piece of the mathematic equation, and that miss caused you all that anxiety. Well, maybe it's not math, but how often do we do the same thing as adults? We miss one factor in the equation as we calculate the things that we're facing, the problems we're going through, the trials that we're experiencing. We leave out one particular factor in our equations, and I think that's what Mark 6 is actually getting at. So, as we look at Mark 6, we want to do 2 specific things. Number 1, we want to look at the details, the when, where, how, why, who, and so forth, that are all throughout Mark's reports of these events, so that we might understand, so that we might see Jesus more clearly and behold him before our eyes. Second, as we go along, spoiler alert, we'll notice very quickly that the disciples' responses to both miracles are far from ideal. What was it that they failed to factor into the equation of their experience? So we'll start with the so-called feeding of the 5,000 in verse 30. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Well, where had the disciples just been? You'll recall from Drew's sermon last week, or by looking back at the earlier portions of Mark chapter 6, the disciples had been sent out by Jesus in pairs and with delegated authority from him. With that delegated authority, they had taught, they had healed, they had cast out demons. They'd been busy. And Jesus, in his attentive, compassionate care, is aware of their fatigue. He is aware of their needs. And so first, he graciously lets them relay everything they wanted him to know about their experience. And then he tells them to come away and rest to a place where they can be nourished with food and rest and quiet. Sounds so peaceful, doesn't it? Rest, peace, quiet. But then we come to verse 32. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, so he began teaching them many things. So the disciples did head out to that solitary place to find some rest, but their departure in a boat onto the sea or lake of Galilee was observed by the townspeople. And while the disciples are weary and worn, the townspeople don't seem to have any such fatigue. On the contrary, they run. In fact, they run so fast around the lake, keeping an eye on the boat the whole time. While the disciples row, the people run, so that when the disciples arrive in a wilderness that was supposed to be a place of rest and quiet, they find a crowd of possibly up to 25,000 people waiting for them. How's that for a solitary place? Now, you didn't mishear, by the way. It's not 5,000. 5,000 is the men. We know that there were women and children there as well, and so conservative estimates are 20 to 25,000 people. That's the entire population of the city of Zion, all gathered together in that solitary place, waiting for Jesus and the disciples. Imagine what's going through the disciples' mind at this point. Primed for rest, exhausted, expecting respite, they are instead greeted by a needy crowd. We can understand if they might be stressed, perhaps exhausted, ready to rebuke the crowd even, angry, bitter that all these people are there. And then they see Jesus, and he has a different reaction. What's going through his mind? Well, we may have to wonder what the disciples are thinking. We don't have to wonder what Jesus is thinking because it's there in the text. While to the disciples, the crowds were likely a nuisance at best, to Jesus, they were people in need. And he responds not with annoyance, but with compassion. Why? Because when he looks at them, he sees sheep wandering and lost, in need of a shepherd, in need of someone to lead them. So he steps in and he does just that. He begins to teach them all kinds of things. And we know from the accounts in the other Gospels, he's not only teaching, he's also healing people within that crowd. This, by the way, is the only miracle that is recorded in all four Gospels. Now, my students this morning said, what about the resurrection? Okay, fair. Yes, the resurrection, definitely a miracle, definitely appears in all four. But in terms of his pre-crucifixion life, the only miracle of Jesus that appears in all four Gospels is this one. That's significant. There's something God is trying to get across to us in this particular miracle. But so far as we read, we don't see the disciples doing anything. Now, maybe they were, but at least as far as Mark records, only Jesus begins ministering to the crowd, while the disciples, it would seem, are able to look on and watch. Their involvement doesn't come until verse 35, where we read, "By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him." And what do they say? This is a remote place, and it's already late. Send the people away, so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. When they do get involved, it's to make their case that Jesus send the crowd away. Now, it is possible that the disciples did in fact have compassion on the people, did want them to get something to eat, and were perplexed about how to make that happen. But the more likely reading in Mark's context is Jesus welcomes them and the disciples want them to go away. And this may be a very convenient excuse to get the crowd to go away. You know, Jesus, these people are really hungry, and this is a really remote place. You remember that solitude we were supposed to have? So maybe we should send the crowd away to get something to eat, so we can rest. Well, what about Jesus? The disciples want them set away, but Jesus welcomes them. Perhaps the disciples are cranky here. Perhaps they're trying to mask their impatience with a veil of apparent compassion. We can only speculate here, but we do know what Jesus said to them. He answered, "You give them something to eat." Now, if we're right in thinking that the disciples are just trying to get the crowd to go away, this is not how they expected or wanted Jesus to respond. You're right, they're hungry, so feed them. That's not what we meant, Lord. In fact, they respond, that would take 8 months of a man's wages. So are we supposed to go spend that much on bread and give them something to eat? That does not sound like people who are ready to serve the crowd. It's safe to say that Jesus' response, not the response the disciples were hoping for, that it was the last response they would have wanted. And we notice how quickly they respond with math. Clearly, they've already gotten this one in their head. They didn't do a quick study. They were prepared. Oh, Jesus, it would take 8 months' salary to feed all these people. That's what it would take. Is it because they're truly considering trying to meet the needs of the people? Or is this an equation they call to the witness stand in their defense to send the crowds away? Do they have that much money in their treasury, but think it would be a waste to use it in this way? Have they been saving up for a while in hopes of something else and don't want to lose it? Or maybe they don't have this money and they're trying to point that out to Jesus. They've made a calculation, but they forgot to factor something into it. Well, Jesus says, give them something to eat. Is he simply calling their bluff? I know what you're up to. Or, as some have speculated, does Jesus anticipate that the disciples who had just been given delegated authority from him at the beginning of the chapter, casting out demons, healing the sick, should actually be able to perform this miracle themselves? That's one possibility. Well, Jesus asks them, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Well, Jesus meets them on their own terms. They want to talk math? Jesus can talk math. Well, how many loaves do you have? Well, they hadn't done that equation yet. And here's one of those understatements in the Bible. When they found out, how long do you think it took them to poll 25,000 people to find out how much food they had? Do you have something? No. Do you have something? No. Do you have something? No. You got any food? No. And one kid, I have a lunch. And so they come back to Jesus, 5 and 2 fish. Notice that he asked them, how many loaves? 5 loaves and 2 fish. I mean, are they looking for extra credit here? Not sure. Maybe you've noticed the error in their equation, because we know, how in the world are they going to feed all these people with 5 loaves and 2 fish? I wonder, kids, can you figure out what they forgot? Who they forgot? Somebody said it back there. They didn't factor in Jesus. They've seen Jesus do an awful lot of things so far. In Mark, they've seen Jesus drive out demons on multiple occasions. They've witnessed him heal leprosy, paralysis, even death, among many other medical healings. They've seen him calm a raging, deadly storm on the sea with a word of his mouth, causing them to ask, who is this? Well, apparently they still haven't come to the right answer, because faced with a crowd of hungry people and nowhere near enough food to feed them, it never occurs to them, hold on, we've got Jesus. If he can do all these other things, I wonder what he's going to do now. That doesn't even seem to be on their radar. So they fail to factor him into the equation and determine that there's no way out of this predicament except to send the people away. And then Jesus makes it even more complicated for them. He directs them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven. He gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Once again, what are the disciples expecting at this point? How long does it take to organize 25,000 people on a hillside into groups of 50 and 100? It's already late in the evening. What are they thinking as they do this? Do they have any clue what Jesus is doing? And presumably the people are asking the same thing. Why are you organizing us like this? Like nobody knows what's going on except Jesus. Disciples don't know, the people don't know, and after they're all seated, what do they see? Some of these people are in the back of the crowd, like you guys, up in the far end of the balcony, straining, and they see Jesus hold up a couple loaves of bread and pray. What's going on? Somebody in the back, if they had any clue, by the way, thinking, I'll bet he's going to feed everybody. Oh, I'm not getting any morsels out of that. I'm all the way back here, and there's 5 loaves. Well, when he gave food to the disciples to distribute, we don't know how this worked. What happened? I mean, use your imagination for a moment. Get into the text. He handed them, presumably he broke the loaves and he hands it to his disciples. And what happens next? They're supposed to distribute it. So I'm a disciple, maybe I'm looking at half a loaf of bread in my hand. So I tear off a piece and I give it to somebody. What happens then? Do I look in my hand and it's full again? We don't know, but it was miraculous. Whatever happened, the disciples were given this little bit, and as they passed it out, they weren't running out. It just kept happening. What's going on? And the people are probably seeing this too. Nobody understands what's going on, but they're seeing something miraculous. Wow. But there are some specific details that Mark mentions. Why mention that the grass is green? Mark is the shortest gospel. He does not waste words on trivial details. Does it change our understanding to know that the grass was green? You know, Jesus miraculously fed 25,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish out on the grassy hillside. Who cares? Oh, well, the grass was green. Oh. Why does he mention that? Psalm 23. Jesus saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He sets a table before me. Oh. Jesus, Mark wants us to understand, is living out Psalm 23 right in front of them. Who is it that makes me lie down in green pastures and sets a table before me? Kids, who does it in Psalm 23? God. So if Jesus is doing it, then Jesus is God. And the disciples are not getting that. And by the way, we probably wouldn't have either. It's often said by skeptics that Jesus never claimed to be God. And the New Testament, specifically the Gospels, don't claim that he's God. Well, the only reason they can say that is that they miss all of these Old Testament references to things that God does, and they're all applied to Jesus over and over and over. To somebody who knew their Old Testament and read the Gospels, they could not miss Jesus is God, Jesus is God, Jesus is God, Jesus is God. Remember that thing in the Old Testament God did? Here's Jesus doing it. Remember that reference in the Old Testament about God? Here's Jesus fulfilling it over and over. So don't let anybody get away with telling you the New Testament doesn't say that Jesus is God. Oh, yes, it does. Everywhere. Let's take a look at some more of this. Another clear Old Testament reference to God that Jesus is living out is miraculously feeding crowds in the wilderness. The manna which God provided to the Israelites wandering in the desert after they were freed from Egypt. If you're not sure about that, maybe you think, Leo, you're just coming up with stuff. Take a look later at John's account of this very miracle. The crowds the next day are using this against Jesus to try to get him to give them more bread. you know, Jesus, Moses gave our fathers bread in the wilderness, and you gave us bread in the wilderness yesterday. So you're Moses. Give us more bread. And Jesus' reply to them is essentially, you know, Moses didn't give you the bread. You're this close. Good reference, you caught it. Way to go. But I'm not Moses, because I gave you the bread. Moses didn't give you the bread. God gave you the bread. So if I gave you the bread, that makes me Moses. They don't get it, but they're this close, because even the crowds grasped that this miraculous provision of bread in the wilderness is a clear reference to what God was doing with manna in the book of Exodus. But they wanted Jesus to be Moses, and he's something far greater. And the disciples missed these clear references to Jesus' divinity in this chapter, and there are more that have already been sprinkled throughout the book of Mark thus far. And that's the core of our text this morning. This seems to be what Mark is getting at. We'll see that in a moment. What about Mark's note that they ate and were satisfied? Why does he include that? Well, they were starving out there in the wilderness. Maybe not literally starving, but they were feeling the hunger. Jesus didn't give them a bite to tie them over until they got home. They were full. Jesus provided in abundance. How about those 12 basketfuls of leftovers? The English translation misses something here, and that's not because it's a bad translation. I don't mean that the translators got it wrong. In the Greek, there are different words for different kinds of baskets. And these baskets here in the feeding of the 5,000 are different baskets from the ones in the feeding of the 4,000 that will come later. This is a single basket that you would include one particular meal within. It's one serving. After all is said and done, Jesus has provided 12 meals for 12 disciples. He cares for them. Remember, they came to the wilderness expecting to get food. And at least as far as we can tell in Mark, they haven't eaten anything yet. How are you feeling if you're a disciple and Jesus said, I'm going to give you food, but first, I'm going to make you hand out food to 25,000 people, and you don't get to eat it yet. But then at the end, he's got them. He's covered them. He's provided for them. It's beautiful. Which brings us to the second miracle. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. The disciples, having just been provided with food, are still weary. There's still a huge crowd of people, all abuzz about what they've just witnessed, and we notice more compassion and care from Jesus here. This crowd has to be dismissed. Jesus could have used help doing that, but he sends the disciples away and alone, and in one of the more understated moments in the book of Mark, it just says, he dismisses the crowd. Almost like, and that concludes our service, see you next week. And everybody left out in an orderly fashion. Many of you are already aware, if you don't know, I'm the youth pastor. And youth pastoring has been likened to herding cats. There's some truth to that. Love our students. But when we dismiss at the end of an event, it is very rare that everyone leaves in an orderly fashion and that it takes a minute. Normally what happens is there are 3 or 4 people that come up to the front and they have requests, or they want to know when the next event is, or they want to sign up, or they have a question, or they want prayer, or they want some counsel, and that's wonderful. And then there's normally 3 or 4 more that come back after that. And one of the reasons that we have volunteer staff is that normally 3 or 4 may be coming and talking to me, and another 2 are talking to Pedro and Hannah, and then 2 are talking to Anna and Luke, because there are needs. That's with about 30 people. Jesus has 25,000. And I guarantee you people have questions. And people want something from Jesus. But he sends the disciples away, and he does all that work. How long does it take to dismiss 25,000 people, excited people, people who ran around the lake to get there in the first place, who sat under his teaching, who were healed, who received the miracle of the food? It took a long time. But he takes it all upon himself and gives his disciples rest. He gets alone himself then. He gets away with his Father. By the way, that's what Jesus always did when he needed rest. He got alone to pray and be alone with God. That's a whole nother sermon for us for another time. Now, it's important to note at this point that the Sea of Galilee, often referred to as a lake, is essentially a big circle, and it's largely surrounded by hills and mountains, so that whenever anybody stood on a hill or a mountainside looking out over the lake, they could actually see the whole lake from where they were. So any boat on the lake was visible. That's become important here in a moment. Verse 47, when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Now, given the geography of the Sea of Galilee, it did not take miraculous sight for Jesus to see the disciples in the middle of the water. These disciples, already looking for rest, having just seen their respite interrupted by a massive crowd, are now once again not resting in a moment where they were anticipating it. Instead, in their exhausted state, they're straining against a headwind that is so strong that when they do eventually reach land, they are well west of the spot that they were trying to get to. They were essentially heading north to the north point in the Sea of Galilee, and they ended up in the northwest corner. Wasn't where they meant to be. Now, Jesus is God. He's on the mountain. He sees them out there. And he has all the power at his disposal to do anything at that point. He could just stop the wind from where he was. He didn't even have to go out there. He could have miraculously caused his voice to go out to the disciples and say, "Don't worry, I've got this. Calm the wind." He could have transported them immediately to the shore, as one of the Gospels says he later does. But he doesn't. In fact, he seems to wait, because it was evening, and it says that it was the fourth watch of the night. That's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So it seems that Jesus saw them there and left them in it for a time. And then when he goes out there and chooses to walk on the lake, he's about to pass by them. He doesn't walk to them. He doesn't walk out calling out, "Hey guys, I've got this, I'm here, don't worry." Jesus is up to something. He intentionally walks out on the lake and goes to pass by them, which many commentators have pointed out is a reference to God in the Old Testament, who often he would pass by his people, specifically Moses. Moses wants to see God's glory, and God has his glory pass by Moses on the mountainside. Another key that Mark is telling us, he's divine, he's divine, he's divine. By the way, if you want to know more on this, there are some apologists on YouTube who have entire videos just on all the references to Jesus' divinity all throughout the book of Mark, because one constant claim of skeptics is that you can read through the whole book of Mark and never find a reference to Jesus' divinity. I hope that we're smashing that just in Mark chapter 6 right now, but be worth using as part of your devotions at some point this week. As Jesus goes to pass by them, we note that the disciples don't even recognize him. They're missing another indication of Jesus' divinity. Now, to be fair, if you and I were tired, exhausted, finally got a meal, now we're out there against the headwind rowing, we're probably not thinking about anything but when is this going to end? They're not looking up thinking Jesus is probably going to walk on the water over there. but maybe they should have. Because they've just seen another clear indication that he's God in his miraculous feeding of the crowd, and the references there. They had been in a worse storm than this earlier in Mark, and Jesus was with them taking a nap in the boat, and when they woke him up, he calmed the storm with a word. There are clear references. This collision of events makes it reasonable to assume that at least one of the disciples would be primed in expectation. Hey, hold on. Look at everything we've seen Jesus do. And we've been in this position before. In fact, we were in a worse storm before. And you remember what Jesus did then? What's he going to do now? Nobody's thinking that. So that when he appears walking on the water, it never occurs to them, it's probably Jesus. No, they go, it's a ghost. They're missing it. And we would have most likely too. Now, by the way, Job 9:8, God alone treads upon the sea. Another clear reference to Jesus' divinity that he's living out in front of them. But they assume the worst, think he's a ghost, and panic. So that once again, the disciples are taking stock of the factors in their situation, and their calculations did not include Jesus, the God-man. They failed to factor Jesus in. And that seems to be what Mark is most concerned to tell us about. So that if you told Mark, oh, okay, those verses are about Jesus feeding the 5,000 and walking on water, he would go, well, yes, but you're missing the main idea. And that seems to come up in verse 51 and 52. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Mark's main idea seems to be the disciples just aren't getting it. Look at all of this that they saw happen. Look at all the clear indications of Jesus' divinity, but their hearts were hard. Have you ever noticed this in Mark 6? Why didn't they recognize Jesus in the water? Because they didn't understand about the bread. Wait, what? Or to put positively, had the disciples understood what was happening when Jesus multiplied the loaves, they would not have been amazed when Jesus walked on the water and calmed the wind. But because they didn't, they were amazed and surprised and afraid, but they didn't have to be. Now, wait a second, the disciples' hearts were hardened. Well, that's another Old Testament reference to Pharaoh, who was against God, and to Israel when God was threatening judgment upon them. This does not put the disciples in a good light. Wait, you mean the disciples? Hold on. They gave up everything to follow Jesus. They just worked miracles with his delegated authority, and you're telling me their hearts were hard? Yep. Even the disciples, seeing all they saw about Jesus, with Jesus right in front of them, could have hardened hearts. And so can we, church. Even with the Spirit within us, our hearts can be hard too. It's a rough accusation to hear. Those who argue that Jesus expected that the disciples could and should have been able to multiply the loaves and fishes also point to this miracle and say they could also have calmed the wind themselves. And that is a possible interpretation. I'm not convinced of it, but it is certainly one potential interpretation here, that what was happening was that Jesus expected, feed them. I gave you the authority. Calm the storm. I gave you the authority. If they're right, then when Mark says they didn't understand about the loaves would mean they could have fixed it then and they could have fixed it now, but they didn't. But it seems to me that what's happening is they keep failing to factor Jesus and his divinity into the equation, just like us. They're constantly slow on the uptake. Back in verse 33, the crowds wore themselves out running to be with Jesus, enthusiastic pursuit. and yet the disciples aren't doing that. And so we come to the final paragraph. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. Pause for a moment. Mark has just put in contrast the disciples who didn't recognize Jesus, and as soon as they land, the crowds do recognize Jesus. And what did they do? They ran throughout the whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. Think about that. They ran everywhere they could, and they're grabbing the sick, putting them on mats, and running with them to wherever they can find Jesus. And wherever he went, villages, towns, countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces, and they begged Jesus to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. Jesus crowds disciples. In Mark 6, at least in Mark 6, the crowds are getting it on some level. But the disciples, who had far more evidence at their fingertips, were not getting it. So once again, the tired disciples arrive, and the crowds recognize Jesus and run everywhere to gather their friends and family to him. Do you notice they still have not gotten their rest? In summary, the disciples ought to be aware of who Jesus is at this point, God in the flesh, but they consistently lose sight of his identity and power in the midst of trying circumstances. Yet the crowds, with presumably less evidence of Jesus' divinity, display more expectation that Jesus can do something about what ails them. I'm sick, Jesus can heal me. I'm lost, Jesus can be my shepherd. Hey, there's not enough food. What do we do about that? Hey, what do we do about this wind? Do you see the contrast? And that brings us to a very brief application for ourselves. How often do we face adverse circumstances and perform complex equations involving any number of human and tangible variables and end up despondent, anxious, and panicked because we neglect to factor in Jesus to the equation? Is it possible that in this entire sermon, the person we most represent is the kid freaking out over his math problem at the table who just forgot to carry the one? Factor in Jesus. He's God himself. How many times have you been in despair and seen no way through, only for Jesus to do something completely unexpected? And he delivers us. And all of a sudden, the anxiety just washes away. And we think, oh, Lord, forgive me for my little faith. You had this in your control all along. I didn't need to be anxious. You had it. Like the disciples in the storm who should have been comforted by Jesus' nearness to them, how often have we been willfully blind to the fact that Jesus is with us in the midst of our trial, and that is enough.